Got it.
Okay. Erev Tov.
Erev
So
Tov.
this is the second time we're discussing, here, Eliezer, you can get into the picture. This is the second time we're discussing this topic. And what I pointed out the first time we discussed it 2 weeks ago was that I think we're mostly very positive about diversity. We understand the benefits and we identify with the benefits and the wealth of diversity. And I certainly think there are several Jewish sources that we will see that express that idea. Many, many, many different sources. We're not even going to be able to see all of them, of course, but we'll see some. And I Dafka wanted to start off by bringing up sources that are not so happy about diversity. And because I think diversity needs balance, and I think to be a nation, we need a framework, and to be a religion, we need a framework. We need something that is common to everyone and is joint. We all join in it together, and it's not something that we have differences about. And we need that for unity. So we're going to continue that today, and we'll discuss it, and we'll see how far it goes. And don't worry, we're not going to stay there the whole time, but I think it's good to open it that way, and then it will end up being well balanced. So we saw previously, we saw the source in the Tosefta, in the Gemara, in Masechet Sanhedrin, that says that in the time of the Sanhedrin, there were not many disagreements in Am Yisrael, differences of opinion. Why? Not because different people didn't have different opinions, because there was a supreme Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, and as the Gemara describes, as the Tosefta describes, when there is a new halachic question, you go to the local court, the Beit Din. The Beit Din gives a decision, or they know they have tradition, or they've learned that issue. And if they have a decision, they give you the decision. If they don't know, they go to a higher court. If they don't know, they go to a higher court in Yerushalayim. 3 courts in Yerushalayim. If no one knows, they reach the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin in Beit HaMikdash, if the Sanhedrin knows the answer to the question, they give it to the people. And if they don't, then they discuss it and argue about it. And then they vote. And the majority vote is the decision. So there's a decision about every dispute, about every disagreement. And they didn't allow the disagreements to grow and become different ways of performing the mitzvot and so on. And I'd like to see, I think we saw this already, but I'd like to once again go over the Rambam. So I'm going to share the screen. There we go. This one. So the Rambam, as we said, is in Hilchot Mamrim, which includes the halachot of the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, and the halachot of Kibud Av V'em. If it seems strange to you that these 2 halachot are together in the same compilation, that's because they're both institutions of authority in the community. And the Rambam says the Supreme Sanhedrin in Jerusalem are the essence of the oral law. They are the pillars of instruction from whose statutes and judgments issue forth for the entire Jewish people. And he quotes from Sefer Dvarim, "You shall do according to the laws which they shall instruct you." This is a positive commandment. And then he says, any person who does not carry out their directives transgresses a negative commandment, as in the same place in Sefer Dvarim it continues, "Do not deviate from any of the statements they relate to you, neither right nor left." Then says the Rambam in Halacha Gimel, here number 3, there can never be any difference of opinion with regard to matters received through the oral tradition. If it was passed down by tradition, there's no disagreement about it. There's no difference of opinion. The halacha was passed down by tradition. Whenever there arises a difference of opinion with regard to a matter that shows that it was not received in regard to a matter that shows that it was not received in the tradition from Moses, our teacher. If there's a disagreement, it can't be tradition. Tradition has one tradition, and if there's a disagreement, it's not passed down by tradition. Not everyone agrees 100% with the Rambam. It seems to make sense, but to be realistic, there are others who don't 100% agree with the Rambam. I'm purposely, intentionally pointing out the Rambam. We're going to see something else from the Rambam soon, Maimonides. He adds, with regards to matters derived through logical analysis, we follow the majority. Of course, when it's not tradition, it's a question that comes up, and we discuss it, and we reach a decision through logical analysis, there will be disagreements. So what do? We follow the majority. Says the Rambam in Halakha 4, when the Supreme Sanhedrin was in session, there were never any prolonged differences. Not there weren't differences. The differences were not prolonged. They were solved and decided quickly. There were not any prolonged differences of opinion among the Jewish people. Instead, if a doubt arose in a Jew's mind over any law, he would inquire of the court in his city, and so on, and he goes through the whole description like we saw in the Gemara. Everyone comes to the Supreme Sanhedrin, and then there's a decision, so there are no prolonged differences. Says the Rambam, and you can hear him krechts when he says this, you can hear him moaning when he says this, when he writes this. After the Supreme Sanhedrin was nullified, differences of opinion multiplied among the Jewish people. He's saying this with a sad look on his face. It's a very sad thing that we're supposed to be together in Eretz Yisrael and function together as a nation, as a religion. And here there isn't a major court that decides. There isn't a central court that decides for everyone, and everyone has their own way and their own halakha and their own rabbi who gives them a decision. And we have all kinds of different ways of performing the Torah, and it's not good, it's not healthy. I'm going to move on to the next source, and then after the next source, I'm going to open for discussion. The next source is also the Rambam, but it's in Hebrew. I'm sorry, I did not find it online in English. Find it online in English, and want to send it to everyone now, that's great. In the Rambam's introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, he discusses the whole tradition of the oral Torah in Am Yisrael, and he says the following, I will translate. Aval Omram. We saw in the Gemara that in the beginning there weren't many differences, and then the Gemara says, Misherabu Talmidei Shammai veHillel, when there were many students of Shammai veHillel, Shelo Shimshu Kol Tzorkan. The English translation of this we saw last week is they insufficiently studied, at least one translation of it, here in yellow. Insufficiently studied. We're going to discuss that. Is it their fault? Are they at fault, these disciples of Shammai and Hillel? There was something in their study that caused a situation that Ravta Machloket B'Yisrael. There were a lot, Ravta from the word Harbe, there were a lot of disagreements in Am Yisrael. Rambam says, Hinei inyan ele advarim mevoar meod. It's very clear. Lefi sheshnei anashim im yu shkulim betvuna uveyun uveydiat ha'ikarim. If two people are very balanced in their thinking, they're wise, they've studied a lot, and they know the basic concepts from which we derive decisions. Lo tipol benehem machloket klal b'ma sheyotziu be'ekesh. If people are wise, they're learned, they have the basic concepts, they have the basic ideas, they will not disagree on anything. Logic, says the Rambam, is like science. If you do it properly, you work logically, A leads to B leads to C, they will reach the same decision. Ve'im tipol tiyeh mu'ata. The Rambam has to admit that sometimes they might have some disagreements, but they won't be many. In all the years of Shammai veHillel, they disagreed only on a few individual things. Their logic was similar to one another. They reached the same resolutions, and only on a few small things they disagreed. And the basics were the same, and so they didn't have many differences of opinion. Says the Rambam, what happened in the next generation? When the students didn't study as well as the teachers, and their wisdom, their ability of study relative to Hillel and Shammai, their rabbis, was lessened. Suddenly now, it became a situation where there was a lot of disagreements. Because each one of them used his own wisdom. They weren't as wise as Shammai v'Hillel. Each one of them used a different kind of wisdom. And says the Rambam, it's not their fault. Don't blame them for that. We can't demand from every two people to argue with the wisdom of the wisest people. And he takes, for example, he doesn't take Moshe Rabbeinu as an example. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is even higher. But he uses Yoshua and Pinchas, two leading figures in the generation after Moshe Rabbeinu. Not everyone is as wise as them. Not everyone has their brains, their IQ. So we can't blame people and be critical of them that they're not as wise as their rabbis. But because of this is the reality. Because of this, there were a lot of disagreements. Not because they disagree on the tradition. Shmuah is tradition. Shmuah is tradition because it's the word shama. There are things, there are parts of Torah. How do you know them? You heard them from your elders. Father passed to son, mother to daughter. That's how rabbi to disciple. That's how it was passed on from generation to generation. And everybody heard it, shama, from the previous generation. That's why it's called Shmuot. It's not because they made a mistake in the tradition. And one of them received truth and one of them received something which is false. But it's because they were not as wise as their rabbis and their logic wasn't as perfect. And we find ourselves in a situation, sad situation, a negative situation. It's not meant to be. That in a later generation, there are a lot of disagreements between different rabbis. And Rambam is sad about this. So this is the Rambam. Again, I'm going to stress, I'm going to underline that the Rambam is saying that if you use logic properly, there will be no differences of opinion, even in things that have to be decided according to logic. If logic is good, is strong, it has basic concepts, you apply it properly, you won't reach disagreements or maybe only a few disagreements, and the Torah will be one Torah. So I'm opening for everybody to comment. Is there anything you want to say about what the Rambam says? Go ahead, Nitael.
Yeah, I just have one question. Can you remind us when and why the Sanhedrin disappear? Why we didn't have this continuity?
Okay, because Sanhedrin is only in Eretz Yisrael. So there was Sanhedrin in the time of the Second Temple. There was a Mikdash, and there was a kingdom here. In the beginning, there wasn't an independent Jewish king, and then from the time of the Maccabim, the Chashmonaim, the time of Chanukah, there was an independent Jewish kingdom here. And even after the Romans took over, and even after the destruction of the Mikdash, there were still Jews in Eretz Yisrael, and they kept studying Torah. At the time of the destruction, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai asked and got from the Romans permission to re-establish the Sanhedrin in Yavne, in the Negev, in the northern part of the Negev, and the Sanhedrin continued there. In the time of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, in the 2nd century, the whole area of the south was destroyed, and the Sanhedrin, the Gemara calls it, the Talmud calls it, the Sanhedrin went into exile in the north of Israel, not out of Israel. Exile in the Galil, in the north, and the Sanhedrin was in Usha and Tzipori and Beit She'arim and Tveria. These are places you can see in the Galil. That's why there are graves of scholars of Tanaim in the Galil, because in that period, in the 2nd and 3rd century, the area of Yerushalayim and the south were all destroyed. And in Jerusalem, became a Roman capital of idolatry. But they continued learning Torah, and they had a Sanhedrin in the north. But after another generation or 2 or 3, even that was dwindling. Jews were leaving Eretz Yisrael to go to Babylonia. and the Jewish existence in Eretz Yisrael weakened and weakened until it never became totally zero, but it was very weak. There were not any prominent Torah scholars in Eretz Yisrael. Politically, there was nothing here. Financially, it was very weak. So in that time, there was no Sanhedrin because you can't have the Sanhedrin outside of Israel. So you have scholars, you have Talmidei Chachamim, you have rabbis teaching, passing on the tradition, making decisions. And that, where was the center for Am Yisrael? That moved from one exile to another throughout generations. In the beginning, it was in Babylonia for several hundreds of years. And then it became in North Africa and in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And in the turn of the 20th century and after the Shoah, I moved to the United States. And in my life, I say this because it excites me very much. In my life, it moved back to Eretz Yisrael after thousands of years. I remember as a young yeshiva student, the great rabbis were in America. There were also rabbis in Eretz Yisrael. And I remember noticing that has changed, that young students come to study Torah in Eretz Yisrael. They can be Haredi, but the strong yeshivot are in Eretz Yisrael, and they come to study here. And they, ironically, they make a Zionistic statement by coming to study Torah in the state of Israel. But in any case, the Torah, the center of the Torah, is returned to Eretz Yisrael. But Sanhedrin was never established again in the Galuyot, in the exiles, because it can only be in Eretz Yisrael. So from about the 3rd century, maybe 4th, I think in the 4th, there was still Sanhedrin, but it was on its last, breathing its last breaths.
Right.
For instance, one of the last things they did, you need Sanhedrin to make decisions about the Jewish calendar. So they set the Jewish calendar for thousands of years ahead.
Right.
Right. So that we would have a calendar.
Mm-hmm. We have to remember Napoleon.
What about him?
We have to mention Napoleon. He tried to establish a Sanhedrin in France.
Okay.
We have to give him credit, at least.
Okay.
Actually, Napoleon did great things in French for the Jewish people, creating, all the one single institution called the consistoire, which regroups, which should be the representative of Jewish people toward the state, toward Napoleon.
Right.
So actually, he did very great things for Jewish in this time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
As much as I would love to think that logic settles all debates, I think it's been proved false. And when you say that, like point number 3, that there can be no difference of opinion with regard to matters received through the oral tradition, the question is, how do you interpret the oral tradition? Like people who murdered Rabin thought that they were following the Torah, whereas I think it's clear that they weren't. And but at the time, I was alive at the time, adult, and I heard respected rabbis talking about debating whether or not to murder Rabin. And now, today, I'm very glad to hear that Rav Tzvi says that Hamas is not Amalek, or that the Palestinian people aren't Amalek. Maybe Hamas is different, but there are a lot of people who say that Palestinian people are Amalek, which means that justifies murdering them. And again, I think that logic would dictate Rav Tzvi's position. But on the other hand, now you might say, well, maybe we don't have a Sanhedrin, but I think it's very problematic, this point.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I totally agree with the first thing you said. I think that the Rambam I don't accept what he's saying here. To think that I think the Rambam really thought that in many ways, in many aspects, that he thinks that his logic, for instance, he has proof of God's existence, philosophical proof. It has to do with everything in the world being complex, being put together from a few things, like a human body or anything else. It's made up of different particles. And if it's made up of different particles, there has to be something that puts those particles together. And that something that puts the particles together has to be oneness in itself, because if it's two parts, then somebody else put those two parts together. So the Rambam considers this to be a logical proof of the existence of a higher force of God. And I like his claim. But maybe he's influenced by his time. Maybe I'm influenced by my time. Everything is much more relative in our times, the thinking. So I don't live with an absolute proof. I live with a belief, with emunah, not with an absolute proof. But I understand the point you're making, and I would have said it myself, and you said it for all of us, that I think the Rambam is going too far. And I don't expect that really everything is going to work logically, and we're all going to have the same the same rules of logic, and rules of logic are going to work in such a functional, accurate, scientific way, and we're going to agree. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't probably there are different concepts and ways of working with logic. By the way, the details that you gave, I'm not sure I would agree with those examples because those are applications of the law. Right. How do we apply them in different times? The law itself is agreed upon. There is a din of rodef. There is a halacha, a mitzvah of Amalek. Do we apply it here? Do we apply it there? Those are not. That doesn't contradict what the Rambam said here, but that's not the main point. So let's not go off to that. But in any case, I also would like to disagree with the Rambam and show you a different opinion. Okay, and I'd like to claim that I have a source that understands differently the idea of this sentence about the disciples of Shammai and Hillel who did not study well enough. They didn't study properly. What is the term? Is that the Rambam says we can't blame them. They didn't do anything wrong. They are weaker intellectually than their rabbis. It's not their fault. And I would like to claim that the sources show that there is criticism of them, and I'd like to show you that. But beforehand, if anyone else wants to say something here. Okay, if not, so let's move on to some other sources. Okay. This is a Mishnah. It says on the top Talmud Bavli, but we're starting with a Mishnah. Mishnah in Masechet Sotah. There's a halacha in Hebrew. It's called Egla Arufa. If you find a dead body, someone who was murdered, and we don't know who murdered him, so we measure what is the closest city, the place where the body was found, and the elders of that city have to go, and there's a whole ceremony that they do, and they have to proclaim, we did not shed this blood, and so on. And I would say it's a halacha about not allowing us to be indifferent to someone being murdered. By the way, we mentioned this in Shiurim in the past. It's brought in the Torah in Sefer Dvarim in the middle of all kinds of halachot that have to do with war, which I understand to say to us, when you're at war and you're killing the enemy, don't become indifferent to death. If someone was murdered, this is not war, this is not just, this is not justified, then you have to make a big issue of it, so that maybe that will help us find the murderer, but also just don't be indifferent to the fact that someone was murdered. And one of the things they do in the ceremony is that they kill a certain calf from the neck. It's called Egla Arufa. So the Mishnah says, if the murderer was discovered before the heifer's neck was broken, it goes free and feeds with the herd. So there's no reason to kill the heifer. So this is just the beginning of the Mishnah. There are a lot of different rules about Egla Arufa that are brought in this Mishnah. Then the Mishnah moves on to other issues. The Mishnah says the following. When murderers multiplied, the ceremony of breaking a heifer's neck was discontinued. The rabbis decided This is only applicable if there is a rare case of murder. When murder is multiplied and it's happening all the time, like, I don't know what the situation is now. It's not news right now, but before the war, there were so many, in the last year, there were so many murders in the Arab society in Israel. Happening
Right.
so much, it's not right, it's not appropriate to have this ceremony of this heifer, because it's just, you're out of the ballpark already. There's so many murders. It's terrible. It's not about one murder. So they stopped the ceremony. And the Mishnah continues to other such examples and says when adultery was multiplied, the ceremony of the bitter water was discontinued. And it was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai who discontinued it. The bitter water for a woman who's accused of being unfaithful to her husband and so on. So the Gemara says when there were many adulterers, meaning the husband blames his wife, but what if he's not honest to her, he's not faithful to her? So when it turned out that there were many men who were adulterers, they stopped the ceremony. It's not, if it's something out of the ordinary, very unusual, then we can make an unusual ceremony. If it becomes the society is all full of this sin, it's sinful, certainly. But if the society is full of these sins, then the society cannot now make a ceremony for one such case. And then Yochanan, the high priest, brought to an end the confession made at the presentation of the tithe. There's a special confession. It's a positive confession. It's not a confession, I sinned. Father, I have sinned. It's a confession, Father in heaven, I have done what you said. It's in Sefer Dvarim in Parashat Ki Tavo, right after the mitzvah of the Bikurim. And the person says a whole list of mitzvot that he performed in taking the tithes from the fruits. And Rabbi Yochanan ended saying the event where people would say this confession. Why do you think he did that? Because people weren't doing it properly and still came to say the positive confession. You can't play these games, he said. You're not taking the tithes properly. You can't come and say the positive confession. And we'll move on. This is the Mishnah. Then on the next page, the Gemara goes into a whole list. Look at this. When hedonists multiplied, justice became perverted. Conduct deteriorated, and there is no satisfaction to God in the world. When they who displayed partiality and judgment multiplied, the command, you shall not be afraid of the face of man, became void, and you shall not respect persons in judgment, ceased to be practiced. Meaning, one of the rules of a judge is you have to not be afraid of any man. In Hebrew, lo taguru mipnei ish. If you're afraid of confronting other people, you can't be a judge. Then you can't judge properly. You have to be willing to confront a person who's lying in the court or something like that. And so this commandment not to be afraid of the face of man was stopped, and it became void. And they also stopped the rule not to show respect to people in judgment, which means don't show special respect to one of the sides in a case. You have a case, there are two sides, you have to show them equal respect. Don't show respect to one side. And they stopped doing that as well. And so people threw off the yoke of heaven and placed upon themselves the yoke of human beings. So everything was a bribe, and the judges tried to please those who they wanted to please, and it wasn't just judgment. When they who engaged in whisperings in judgment, what is whisperings in judgment? You whisper in the judge's ear how do you say?
To find.
Favor?
To find.
Favor? Who to favor in the judgment, yes. So there were when there were a lot of people engaging in whispering in judgment, so fierceness of the divine anger increased against Israel, and the Shekhinah departed, the divine presence of Hashem left us. If that's what your courts look like, I will not dwell among you, because it is written, he judges among the judges. Hashem is present with the judges. When the judges are not judging justly, Hashem is not amongst them. When there are multiplied men of whom it is said their heart goes after their gain, meaning they weren't doing things for truth, for just purposes, but for their own gain. They're multiplied, they who call evil good and good evil. When they're multiplied, they who call evil good and good evil, woes increased in the world. Many issues, many consequences, many occurrences about we said, whoa, we were crying, we were complaining, suffering in the world. Okay, listen to this. So at part of that long list is the two following things. When the haughty of heart multiplied, dissensions increased in Israel. We're talking about dissensions in Israel. What is this? What does one have to do with the other? Why, when there were many haughty at heart, the dissensions increased in Israel? And then the Gemara says, when the disciples of Shammai and Hillel multiplied, who had not served their teachers sufficiently, that's the same sentence we saw in the Tosefta and in Masechet Sanhedrin, dissensions increased in Israel and the Torah became like two Torahs. I think this shows us that the students, the disciples, not serving their teachers sufficiently is something that they are to blame for. It's not just that they weren't as wise as their rabbis. They did something wrong, just like the whole list is of people who are doing things wrong. We started with murderers, with adulterers, with people who don't take the tithes properly, hedonists, people who favor one man over another in the court, people who whisper to the judges who to favor in the court, people who go after gain and they're not seeking truth, people who are haughty, and people who don't serve the teachers sufficiently. So I think it's clear from these sources that the problem is not a problem of IQ, they're not as wise as their teachers. They did something wrong. Now look at the words. The words are, when the haughty of heart multiplied, dissensions increased in Am Yisrael, in Israel. And when disciples of Shammai and Hillel did not serve their teachers sufficiently. Why are these two? I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but remember these two definitions. Haughty of heart. Why does haughty of heart cause dissensions? And why does not serving the teachers sufficiently cause dissensions? You're welcome to offer answers to the question.
It makes sense if they didn't study properly, they didn't
serve their
really,
teachers properly.
right. So then that's why they were teaching different things than what the rabbis were teaching.
Why does it have to do with not serving their rabbis properly?
Because that means that they thought that they knew better than their rabbis. That's where the haughtiness comes from. That they thought.
So you're putting the haughtiness together with not serving the rabbis. They thought that they know best. They don't need to serve the rabbis anymore, or they can disagree with them and overrule them. That's one possibility.
That's Yohara. In other words.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one possibility. Others?
In general, what you've got is a disregard for some kind of a standard.
Mm-hmm.
In both of those situations. In other words,
in the previous situations in that Gemara.
Yes, there's
that whole list.
Parallel across the list, on the list.
Yeah.
In other words, I know better. I know better than you.
Or I don't care about truth. I don't care about standards.
Okay, either way, but
I do what's comfortable for me. I do what I benefit from.
And that what they're saying here is that led to a dissolution of the judgmental system, the legal system.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, it's like all hell broke loose.
Yeah. I would add, Eliezer, you want to add something?
Well, I think haughty of heart, we see a lot, right? People don't want to listen to the other person. They don't want to view them as human beings. They feel that they're superior, and therefore their opinions, that no other opinions should be. and serving the teachers might be similar. It might be that the teachers had an idea and they wanted to teach that, but they didn't want that to be the sole idea. I mean, like, especially with Shammai and Hillel.
Okay, so haughtiness causes people to be not sure of themselves, but not listening, not attentive to others, not attentive to other opinions. Maybe also they're arrogant and they're not willing to admit when they're proven wrong. So they keep on fighting for something which is a mistake, or they're not even listening to what someone who's trying to argue with them. So there's never any real clarification of the issue. They don't really take into consideration all the sides of the issue. They just decide on what their first thought about the issue, and another person has another thought, and they fight it out with one another, but they're not seeking the best decision. They're each one fighting to be. It's like it becomes a sport.
Their own position.
You want to win. You want to win. You're not looking for the truth. You're looking to win in a sports arena, but you're not looking for the truth. That also can have to do with not serving their rabbis, their teachers properly, meaning they did not study it in depth. They just took what they took from their teachers and then battled about it with others, but they didn't try to study it in depth and then be able to discuss it with people who had other opinions. Another idea of what might be going on here is the idea that they were not willing to accept the decisions of the Supreme Court, meaning there is a Supreme Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, and maybe they were haughty and they were not willing to accept what it said. And if they're haughty and not willing to accept what it says, then you lose the unity. The whole description of how there's unity, because there's a high court and the disagreements are not prolonged, doesn't work if people are not willing to accept the decision of that Supreme Court. As it says in the Pasuk, which we quoted before, do not deviate from the statements that they relate to you, neither right nor left. And if they decide right, you have to go right. And if they decide left, you have to go left. And if you're right and you don't want to go left, and you're left and you don't want to go right. So we're torn apart, and we don't have something that keeps us as one functioning nation and one functioning religion. And everybody is mentioning Shammai and Hillel as a positive example. And it is the Gemara about Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, the houses, not the figures, Shammai and Hillel, the rabbis, the houses of disciples that came from Shammai and Hillel. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued over something, over many things. And then the Gemara in Masechet Eruvin says that they argued about it for 3 years. Ad she'atzah bat kol, there was a kind of small voice coming from heaven that said, Eilu va'eilu divrei Elohim chayim. Both of them are the word of God. Ve'alacha keveit Hillel. Which is very interesting, and we're going to discuss it later on when we come to the positive aspects of diversity. But you see with Shammai and Hillel that it's possible that there will be an argument, and both sides will be recognized as relevant, as valid. You have to validate the person who's arguing with you. In one of the practices that of relationships between people, one of the things you have to do is you have to learn how to argue constructively, and not if you start blaming and you're not listening and you're not thinking about this, or if you're not making claims, you're just throwing things at one another, then you can't truly discuss and even disagree on something. And one of the things that people train to be able to maintain a relationship with our disagreements, but we can continue with a relationship is first of all to express what the other person said, so you see that I'm listening to you, and make sure you understood what the other person is saying. So you're not just saying what I think and throwing it at the other, you're also making sure that you understand what they say. And even before you disagree with them, kind of to validate that what they say is, I might disagree with it, but that doesn't make you a crazy person. That doesn't make you a a person who's not worthy of living in my society. And then we can discuss and have a discussion about it and hear one another's opinions and try to prove or bring claims one way or the other. And that's very nice about Shammai and Hillel. But I have to warn you, please don't look at the next page.
Okay.
Don't look at this. Close your eyes. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat brings a discussion. There's a whole event that happens. They went up into an attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah. There was a certain person, they went up into his attic, and there was an argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and on that day they decided according to Beit Shammai. Generally, the decision went by Beit Hillel. Here they decided according to Beit Shammai. And here is one of their discussions. When one vintages grapes for the vat, someone help me with this. What is a vat?
When you put in the grapes.
A big thing where you put the grape juice?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Juice
Yeah.
coming from the grapes? Okay. When
Yeah.
one vintages grapes, thank you, for the vat, to manufacture wine, Shammai maintains it is made fit to become unclean, while Hillel ruled it is not made fit, meaning once it's transferred from the place where they would press the grapes into the vat. And Shammai says if an unclean person, an impure person, touches it, it becomes impure. Hillel said it's not yet ready to become unclean. It's not yet made fit to become unclean. Even if an impure person touches it, it's still pure. Said Hillel to Shammai, why must one vintage grapes in purity, yet not gather olives in purity? You agree that when we collect olives and make oil, it doesn't have to be done in purity. So why do you say that with grapes it's different? So Shammai replied, if you provoke me, he replied, I will decree uncleanness in the case of olive gathering too. Whoa, Shammai is not being well behaved today. Shammai answers, if you have to put this on in a theatrical way. What are the words? Here. Hillel, if you provoke me, I'll decree uncleanness in the case of olive gathering too. He threatens him. He doesn't reply. He doesn't make a claim. He doesn't say something logical. He just threatens him. A sword, says the Gemara, was planted in the Beit Midrash, and it was proclaimed, he who would enter, let him enter, but he who would depart, let him not depart. They did something forceful to decide who are the people in the Beit Midrash. And on that day, Hillel sat submissive before Shammai, like one of the disciples. Shammai was very forceful on that day, and Hillel sat there submissive before Shammai. And it was as grievous to Israel as the day when the golden calf was made. But they made those 18 decisions that the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat says there are 18 decisions they made that day, all according to Beit Shammai. Somehow Shammai created a majority in that get-together, in that conference of Chachamim. It's like you try to pull someone to your side, whatever you do, you play politics. And Shammai got a majority on that day, and they made 18 decisions according to Shammai. And the Gemara says it's very negative. It was grievous to Israel the day when the golden calf was made. I want unity. I want decisions. We said we want the Sanhedrin to make decisions. And everyone accept the majority rule. So why is this negative as making the golden calf? Because it was done with a sword. Because it wasn't done properly between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, because Shammai did not continue the discussion about the topic, but replied, if you provoke me, I'm going to go even further. And he took out his sword, and he said, nobody can leave. And the Shammai disciples were there, and the Hillel disciples were not there, and they got a majority. And this isn't the way to do it. And it was accepted. What they did was accepted that day. The Yerushalmi, this is the Babylonian Talmud, the Yerushalmi is even worse. The Yerushalmi says the disciples of Beit Shammai stood downstairs and were killing the disciples of Beit Hillel. If disciples of Beit Hillel tried to come up to the attic, the disciples of Beit Shammai would kill them, so they wouldn't join the decision, they couldn't vote. So there's a majority for Beit Shammai.
which is pretty much the opposite of what you
Sorry?
said at the, which is pretty much the opposite of what you said at the beginning.
Yes.
It's not logic at all. It's emotion 100% and force, and that's it.
Yeah. It seems so difficult to accept that there was such an event where Shammai, disciples of Beit Shammai, were killing disciples of Beit Hillel. There are rabbis who say that it's not literal. They don't literally mean they killed them. I don't know, maybe they didn't allow them forcefully, didn't let them enter, join the vote, or something like that. But in any case, it was forceful. Maybe they were just afraid to accept that something like this could have happened. But we know that we have many sources about the good relationship between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. That even though the Mishnah in Masechet Yevamot says that even though they disagreed, there were two things they did not refrain from doing. They would eat with one another, even though they had disagreements on purity or impurity of food or of vessels, utensils for food. They would eat together. How would they do that? They would tell one another, this vessel is okay for me, it's not okay for you. This vessel is okay also for you. That way they could eat together. So if a disciple of Beit Shammai invited over for a Shabbat meal a disciple of Beit Hillel, so they would tell one another what their regulations for kashrut are, and they could invite them. We have a cousin. All of our cousins are in the United States. And one of them had a son who was studying in yeshiva here, and it was Shnat Shemitah 3 years ago. And my sister hosted him for Shabbat. And she was very careful on Shnat Shemitah to buy things that are heter mechira and not what they call Shemitah lechumra. But he wouldn't eat Shemitah heter mechira. So on the Shabbat that he came, she especially went and bought what she doesn't like to buy, but so she could host him. It's possible to do it. You have to be willing to bend a little bit your principles, because it wasn't that she wasn't willing to make an effort. She was, in principle, showing support for the call it something which is more makel, which is more lenient from a Rav Kook, and not something which seems to be more stringent, but it also has negative sides to it. But she was willing to compromise her, her absolute opinions to be able to host someone else. So that's what Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were doing. Also, they would marry one another because there were some differences in opinions that according to one, they could get married, and according to the other, they wouldn't. So in that case, they wouldn't marry because according to one of them, it was forbidden for them to get married. But outside of those cases, they continued to marry with one another so that it wouldn't become two Torah. It wouldn't become two nations. It would be one nation with one Torah. So now how do we reconcile? How do we reconcile that with this description over here? I would say there are two possibilities. The question is, which comes first? Either first they had this story like we find it in the Gemara in Shabbat, and then they saw how detrimental that is. And after that fight, they were attacked by their enemies and were in a bad situation for a period of time. And then when they won the war, they decided that they can't go back to that kind of behavior, and they have to be able to get along with one another even though they disagree. So maybe the negative was first. The negative behavior was first, and then they learned a lesson from it, not to act that way, and then reach the situation that is described in Masechet Yevamot, or the opposite. For a while, everything was nice, but it was naive. There were arguments, there were disagreements, they kept on growing, they kept on getting deeper, and then ended up blowing up. I don't know, I'm not sure which way to go. I saw a certain rabbi who wrote the first option. He said that they learned the lesson from this case and then learned to get along with one another.
Right.
I hope that's the right one, because that's the better one for us.
for us, exactly.
But we have to learn to act in that way. But if I would like to kind of put things together, then what we're saying is there is a limit to diversity. Just like a state has to function together, and you can't have different parliaments and different courts in the same state, and somehow or other, even the court and the parliament have to create some kind of joint, joint ground of what's the term in English? Mechaneh meshutaf. Common denominator. Thank you.
Yeah,
Otherwise, the society can't function, and you can fight for your opinions and your ideals, and you can try to change the law in the ways that are accepted in the parliament and the law, which is true about Judaism as well. You can go to the Sanhedrin, you can argue with their decision, you can try to convince the Chachamim, and maybe you'll get a majority, but you can't have each person doing something different. So on the one hand, it's true that we need, it can't work. And I think this is an important point, and it's the first point that I made last week as well. And I want to stress this as an opener for this series. We can't function as a nation, as a religious nation, we can't function as a religion if everybody totally does their own thing.
Right.
There has to be a common framework. Does
It has
this
to
mean
be
that
a-
there can be no diversity? That's what we'll discuss later on. But also within this rule, we have to understand that we have to find a way to make it function without wars. You're not going to have everything that you want. The decisions of the religious leaders are not all going to be according to what you think. Any one of us. We have to accept, if we want to function as a nation, if you want to be a tribe, if you want to be a Beit Midrash, disconnected from Am Yisrael, do your own thing. But if you want Am Yisrael to keep Jewish tradition and religion and other things that are included in it, then we have to accept that sometimes the decision is going to go against me, and I'm going to have to accept that. And the other person who disagrees with me, he also has to accept that. And then we have to form practical methods of being able to argue and reach decisions, and all accept those decisions. And that's very difficult to do without one high authority. And that's a difficulty that Am Yisrael faces. And that's why the sources that we opened up with are saying when there was a supreme Sanhedrin of Am Yisrael, then it was easier to make these decisions. Since the Sanhedrin, in other words, if I disagreed with the Rambam about saying that if everybody works with logic, everybody will agree with one another, I'm saying now that I agree with the Rambam that having a supreme Sanhedrin helps us create a certain framework that we can all accept and then continue to argue within that. And without it, we have to see how do we create a framework that we all work within that. And on the other hand, we're going to continue, not tonight, but next time, we're going to continue to ask, okay, so if we have, first of all, how do we create a framework when we don't have a supreme Sanhedrin? How do we create a framework that will help us retain this unity and joint framework? And two, how do we make sure, or is it possible? Is it right? Is it good? Is it a positive thing within this joint framework is there room for diversity within that framework? And these are issues to discuss the next time we meet. If anyone wants to make comments, please do.
There was an incident, I think, with Rabbi Yoshua that had to do with the Yom Kippurim,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So that had to do with the
very
setting
good,
of
very
of
good.
the-
So there are three stories about Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua.
Sure, right.
What Tova is mentioning is that there was a disagreement between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua about what day is Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur.
Rabban Gamliel said, for example, Tuesday. Rabbi Yoshua said Wednesday. And Rabban Gamliel was the president of the Sanhedrin, and he forced Rabbi Yoshua to come on the day that, according to Rabbi Yoshua, was Yom Kippur.
Was it Yom Kippur to come?
Come on that day. He didn't say with your car, but that's what I would have said today. Come by car,
Right.
and bring your wallet with you and bring your computer and your cell phone and how do you say להתייצב and report
Right.
yeah,
To come
report to
before
me.
him.
Come before me. And he
Right.
did, and when he did, Rabban Gamliel kissed him
Right.
and said to him, Rabbi
He called
v'talmidi,
him,
my rabbi
right.
and my student.
and my student.
My
Right.
rabbi, because you're greater in Torah than me, and you're my student, that you accepted my decision.
Right.
There were two other cases where they argued that were not as comfortable. And that's a great topic to discuss, Tova. What is the difference between the different cases, or is there a difference? But I would say, and we'll get to it another time, that the question of the date is a crucial issue. The issue of the
Right.
date, we cannot have differences of opinion. We can't have one religion
Right.
celebrating Chagim at two different times.
Right.
So if you disagree with the president of the Sanhedrin about that, you can't have two opinions. You have to show that you accept that opinion.
Right.
I will end with a story, tell you a story about Rabbi Riskin, connected to what you said. In New York, there is an Eruv, part of New York City. Not all of New York City, part of New York City. And it's very questionable halachically because there are New York.
And it's on the west side. It's on the upper west side.
Right. I know that because when I was going to go to America, we were going to be for Shabbat on the Upper West Side, and I checked the map of the Eruv, but we didn't go in the end because of Corona.
I lived there for a few years. It was
But
very
the
convenient.
the Eruv itself is questionable halachically because of all kinds of reasons in the halachot of Shabbat of Eruv. New York is a very big place with 11 million residents and wide, straight roads that go for miles and miles. And it's very questionable, more than questionable, if it's possible to make an eruv in under those conditions. But they made a decision that there is something that you can, what we call in Hebrew, yashar ma lismoch. There are certain things that if people want to trust as a halachic decision and accept that it's an eruv, they can. Rabbi Riskin was the rabbi of
Leave it alone.
and he said that on the first Shabbat, Rabbi Riskin is now 80 something, I believe. He's at the time he was a father of young children, babies, and he said on the first Shabbat after they created the Eruv, he went out with the baby in the stroller to make the point that those who think this is an acceptable halachic decision, that's okay. And he said after that he never trusted it. He didn't like the decision, but he had to show that those who accept it, it's acceptable. So the first Shabbat he did publicly, and then he didn't make a fuss about it, didn't make an issue of it, but he didn't. So it's interesting. But there are many more issues to discuss in our.
That's an important issue because there's so many people with baby strollers and so on and so forth. It gave a kind of freedom that people would not have had on Shabbat. Never mind umbrellas for a minute, but the idea of people with baby strollers.
My daughter with two babies on shlichut in Chutz La'aretz can't go out with her children on Shabbat.
I know. I got it.
It doesn't go out?
No.
No.
They can take turns.
Not with this, not pushing a stroller.
Well, the baby who doesn't even crawl yet.
I know it's it's little.
They have a fenced in kind of little playground in the garden of the building, so that they do, but not out of that.
Right.
Yes.
But it was a tremendous freedom for people in Manhattan.
Eliezer, b'vakasha.
It's certainly too late to go into this now, but is it within the realm of our group to discuss the role of the Supreme Court in Israel as a substitute for the Sanhedrin?
I think maybe we can get a group of friends together and discuss it one time, but I wouldn't do it in the Shiur.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Laila tov.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Laila tov.
Thank you. Shalom.
Bye bye.
I helped